You look at Mexico, they're importing cheap products, undercutting our hardworking men and women, not only here, but in the U.S., from China. They're slapping a Made in Mexico sticker on and shipping it up.
We're going to continue to work with partners like the United States and hopefully Mexico as well to make sure that we are united in our desire to protect good jobs that are more responsible around the environment than they are in China.
Canada, as you can hear, there is bracing for the return of U.S. President-elect Donald Trump to the White House and, of course, a scheduled review in 2026 of the new NAFTA, the so-called new NAFTA. It will be more than a review, according to President Trump, who says he wants to renegotiate the whole thing. Ontario Premier Doug Ford there making a pitch for a bilateral deal with the U.S., cutting out Mexico completely. How might that play out? Pardon me. Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. With me this evening, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt is here. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, and so is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Bensey. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Rob, I'll start with you because I know you're covering the legislature in Ontario. What's the motivation here for the Premier, in your view, to come out with this suggestion at this point in time?
Well, I think it's posturing, and it's not bad posturing, frankly, Vassy, because Mr. Ford is very concerned about what U.S. tariffs, Trump tariffs, will do to Ontario's manufacturing industries and other industries, frankly. And I think that's why he's being so bullish and saying, look, we can't have Mexico we can't have the Chinese using Mexico as a backdoor to cheap EVs into the United States. Remember, Ford was one of the leaders in this country who lobbied Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to match President Joe Biden's 100% tariff on Chinese EVs so that Canada wouldn't be the backdoor to those EVs being dumped into North America. And now Mexico is. And so that's why he's making that point. It's also a little bit of triangulation, frankly, because if you can sort of Trump is somewhat easy to manipulate, as I think anyone who's watched him over the years. And if you say, look, the Mexicans are worse, you can look over there, and maybe he won't turn his gaze to Canada quite as much.
Well, to be fair, Brian, in the comments that we've heard from people around President Trump, and I've tried to ask anyone I can, like, are we going to get exempt? They do single out Mexico way more than they single out Canada. And I think those, as Rob points out, those tariffs that we levied after the U.S. and Europe did was aimed at sort of convincing the U.S., even under this administration, the current one, that we're on board in their fight against China using Mexico as a backdoor. What do you do if you're the Prime Minister, though, and it's, the Premier saying, hey, we should take this route instead?
Yeah, I mean, I think the analysis that Rob provided is bang on. I think that Ford would see an opportunity to sort of give the Trump administration a bit of a way to be hard on tariffs, hard on trade, but at the same time not do damage to our economy, but also to the American economy, because as we have discussed on this panel, many have made the point there's such back and forth for many sectors and trade between Canada and the U.S. and, of course, for the auto sector, which obviously Rob mentioned is important to Ford in Ontario and important to Canada. So I think for the Prime Minister, it's obviously difficult to sort of say, yeah, good idea, because I think he's going to be at a table and, figuratively speaking, sometimes literally, but figuratively, when his government's at the table trying to renegotiate the new NAFTA in 2026. That said, I mean, they're going to have to start to think pretty hard of how they're going to handle this situation, because the U.S. definitely, and even the public, not only elected officials, but even the public, it definitely is a little more pointed towards Mexico. It's not Canada as much, but we get swept up in the talks nevertheless. And we certainly don't want to get swept up in this 10% tariff across the board attitude or any policy that resembles this. So the Prime Minister is really going to have to think with his team of how he handles this delicate and difficult situation.
Lisa, in your view, how is the context different this time versus the first time with Donald Trump? We were together on election night. It was a decisive win. He doesn't have to worry about re-election again. Like there are some big changes in what might incentivize him one way or the other. How do you think that could impact Canada?
I think it could impact greatly, as well as you know, he now has, even though it's a bit tenuous, he does have the House of Representatives, he does have the Senate, he does have his executive orders, he has the Supreme Court. So there's not a lot stopping him from doing what he wanted to do. If you may recall, the way that he was enacting these kinds of tariffs in the past has been through his security orders, his national security orders and presidential powers. He doesn't have to do that this time. He can actually change legislation if he should decide that's the route he wants to go to. And that makes it a little bit more problematic, I think, for Canada. I also think what's different too this time, the personalities are very different. Even though it's Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau, the Mexican president is a very different president. President Sheinbaum is very different than President Peña Nieto, who we had the last time around. The politics match up very differently. So Premier Ford coming out early and saying, well, maybe we do have to do a bilateral, makes a lot of sense and maybe the right path forward in nudging along the federal government to do that kind of deal, as opposed to worrying about the Chinese impact on Mexican decisions, Mexican politics.
Tom, does it make sense to you?
Well, it's not new. The Americans, for example, were finger pointing against Mexico during the initial negotiation of the NAFTA, saying that the maquiladoras, right on the border, they wouldn't have to follow environmental rules. And that led to the creation of a side agreement on environment, the first time an international trade agreement, Vassy, dealt with the environment. And we created this Council on Environmental Cooperation amongst the three countries. So it's something we know how to deal with. I do think that Rob is spot on. I think that this is populism. By Doug Ford, simply pointing to Mexico, trying to come up with an individual case that might or might not be borne out by the facts. But beyond that, I think that what we're witnessing is the breakdown of a worldwide consensus on free trade. Globalization for 30 years has held sway. And, whether it was Bill Clinton back in the day or almost simultaneously, Jean Chrétien said they were going to get rid of free trade. If they got in, and they reinforced it. So it's been widely accepted as the way to create more wealth. But right now, this backlash by Trump, it's not new to this election. It's something that the left has fought against for years, with something called the investor state provision in the North American Free Trade Agreement. That gave investors certain powers above those of individual states. What was the first thing that Trump pulled out of the NAFTA when he renegotiated? He's the one who got rid of the investor state provisions because he didn't like that on different grounds. So it's very difficult to predict right now what the final form is going to take. But I do think, speaking of form, that it's particularly bad form, for the Premier of Ontario to be targeting Mexico, because we have a deal, it has a structure, it has recourses, and what he's trying to do is essentially work that against Mexico in the vague hope, and I think vain hope, that somehow it'll help Canada. I think the Canadians expect better of their leaders than that sort of behavior, frankly.